A Bit Lit, celebrating creativity and research of all kinds.
Olia, hello, how are you?
Hi, I'm really well, thank you. Lovely to be here.
Thank you so much for coming. We start our films by asking contributors to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about what they do. So would you mind doing that, please?
So my name is Olia Hercules. I was born in Ukraine, but I've lived in the UK for the past 18 years now. I used to be a journalist, and then I retrained in 2008 and became a chef. And now I also write cookbooks and cook for a living. And I live in London.
So journalism, and am I right in thinking that the journalism was around film?
Yes, it was. Yeah, yeah, kind of the film business world as it is, and I would be covering Eastern European countries. I was a junior reporter, it wasn't anything. It was my first kind of proper job after university, but it was fun. It was great.
And then moving into the world of both cookery and cookery writing. I have your complete works with me here, which I'm pretty excited to talk to you about. I'm a huge fan, and I mean, I have no idea, so you must tell me, but it feels to me like purely because of a relative lack of cultural knowledge on the part of a UK readership, it would feel to me like this might initially be quite a hard sell talking to a publisher about a culture whose cuisine is not well known in the UK. So yeah, do you mind telling us a little bit about how that was?
I guess now, by now it's probably quite a good selling point if you've got something unique to say. At that point, yeah, nobody was really interested. Not that I pitched my book. It was basically, I wrote some recipes for The Guardian, which was completely by chance. And an agent spotted the recipes. And interestingly enough, every time I'd pitch a recipe to The Guardian, I was a recipe developer at that point, just to mention. I've already done my chef training. Every time I'd pitch a recipe to The Guardian, the editors of Guardian Cook magazine would be really interested in my mom's recipes. So, there was a little bit of interest already. And then an agent spotted those recipes in The Guardian, and then she emailed me and said, well, look, there might be a book in here. To me, it was just, I was like newly unemployed at that point, and quite, a bit of a difficult time in my life. So I went, wow, really? And I went to see the agent, Ariella Feiner, and at United, one of the biggest agencies in Europe, which was kind of all a bit mind-blowing, to be honest with you. Just a little recap, I've just kind of done my Leith's course 2 years previously, and I've been working in all sorts of jobs. I'd do everything, assisting with styling, catering, restaurant shifts. I've done it all. Being a freelancer, it's like every opportunity you get, especially in the food world, you're just like, work. So yeah, so at that point, it was quite mind-blowing to be able to go into this office on Lexington Street and talk to Ariella. And I spoke to her for about 2 hours, and she said, well, you tick so many boxes, every box pretty much, apart from your profile is nowhere near, meaning your Instagram followers. I'm sure I had like 500 or 1,000 or something. And she said, maybe go and do your thing, keep doing it, and then come back in a couple of years and we can talk again. And then one thing led to another, and basically within 2 months after that conversation, I don't know, there must have been something aligning with the planets and the stars, I don't know. Or maybe I just kind of believed finally that maybe there is something in there, and consciously also made my luck, I don't know. Anyway, I started shooting recipes and kind of writing them down. And then within 2 months, there was a publisher, Faber Guardian, who were interested in the book. And then Ariella signed me up, and by April, so I saw her in February, and by April I had 3 publishers kind of bidding against each other for the book. And I think what was different about Mamushka was, you have to produce this big document, basically called a proposal, which is like a mini dissertation, to be fair. I mean, Ariella was like, okay, I've got some publishers interested. You need to write this proposal tonight. So, I put my son to bed. I had a 1-year-old as well at that point. So he went to bed, and I kind of wrote all night and finished at 4 a.m. And there was this document of, I don't know, 25, 30 pages where there was samples of writing, you know, your lyrical writing, an overview of what the book is about, what competition there is, you know, are there other books like that, 12 fully written recipes and 100 recipe titles. So, you know, it was quite intense. But so I had that. And I also had these photographs that I shot with some photographers, you know, because immediately after I spoke to Ariel, I was like, okay, I need to, you know, grab the bull by the horns and kind of make this happen somehow. So I started emailing different photographers who were assistants still at the time, but were looking to do work of their own. So, you know, there's such a thing in the food world where you can do a test shoot. So the stylist, for example, pays for ingredients, and the photographer, you know, will give you their time and maybe a studio or something. You get together and you do this work kind of for free, essentially, just to build up your portfolio. So I did that a couple of times, and you know, a few photographers refused. They were like, "What, Ukrainian food? No, I'm not interested." You know, immediately that get these, you know, ideas that it's all going to be cabbage and potatoes. Which is amazing as the potato and cabbages dishes in Ukraine are. That's not the whole story. So eventually Chris Kirkham, this wonderful photographer who's extremely popular now and successful, decided to do this test shoot with me. So I had the proposal and I had these amazing images from him showing that, you know, it's not just potatoes and cabbages, it's bright and beautiful. And, you know, I pretty much had a sample chapter to show the publishers. And that's why I think these 3 publishers eventually were extremely keen to publish a book like that, because I mean, there have been books published about, you know, centering themselves around Eastern European food, especially in America. I mean, there is, of course, Pleased at the Table by Anya von Bremsen, which is still to this date, you know, published in 1991 or 92, I think. It's still one of the best cookbooks written about Eastern European cuisine. But it didn't have photos, you know, it was like a thick tome, and it didn't have this kind of modern brightness to it with photography, et cetera, you know, things that really make you salivate and imagine the food rather than just read about it. So yeah, and then in the end, I got signed with Octopus, who were, you know, extremely supportive, loved my vision, and made it clear that they'll let me do my thing as well. You know, one of the things that I asked, I was very keen to have kind of done was to shoot the recipes, not just in London, not just in a studio environment, but actually to go to Ukraine and to shoot the people, my family, you know, the markets, kind of just to show what the country is all about. Because of course, that was the time when, you know, the war with Russia started. So Ukraine was quite a lot in the headlines, and it was all to do with the conflict. So it felt really important to me to show the other side of Ukraine, you know, that it's not just, it's not just boiled down to these headlines, you know, there's more to it, that I wanted to show what the people were about. And of course, it's so easy to do through food and culture.
That for me is what your cookbooks are so good at doing, is that kind of way you move us from very personal family history to a kind of wider social history of Ukraine and Eastern Europe more generally, and the way you situate us, particularly in the most recent book, maybe in the kind of the architecture of the home, where cooking happens, which parts of the home. So your most recent book, Summer Kitchen, and getting us to, you know, introducing someone like me who was new to the idea, as to the idea of a kind of external cooking space, which was kind of a refuge, a place for cooking when there wasn't a lot of food around, but also a place for celebrating the food, and perhaps a kind of part of the home as well. Yeah, your work is really strong at getting us to think about where cooking sits in the family.
Oh, thank you. That's kind of the mission. Yeah, I'm glad that you said that. That's very well put. Thank you.
Good. And the photography as well, I can understand how important that was. And I think you were absolutely right to argue for that as part of your books, that really helps you, that plus the writing really helps root us in a world which is new for so many of us, and getting us thinking about cooking, seasonality. There's some really interesting stuff in your most recent book about a kind of generational shift as well, where older members of your family will expect younger members of your family to be doing fermenting, and they'll go, well, when have I got time to do that? So there's really interesting stuff there about change happening right now.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So we've throughout, so many years, like a process like fermentation or whatever has just been, within the fabric of a family's life. It was just done. Everybody did it. Because, of course, as you mentioned before, we used to and still live really seasonally. And quite a lot of people, especially in smaller towns and villages, would have, I say vegetable patches, but quite a lot of people actually have small holdings. And which means, for those who don't know, this is like almost like a small farm, but just like quite a lot of land where you grow vegetables and you live, self-sustainably in a way. And of course, by come September, you'd have a big glut. And what do you do with it? Some of it can be sold at the market, true. Some of it you will eat, but then a lot of it, it would make sense to preserve it for winter, of course, because especially back now, of course, now in supermarkets, you can get out of season tomatoes. But back in the day, you'd get your winter vegetables that you would keep in sand or in your cellar, whatever, your cabbages and your potatoes, etc. But you wouldn't have anything else fresh. And of course, it made sense to, somebody just dropped a few vegetables into a brine at some point and realized that, it does this wonderful thing. And because it's easy, fermentation in English has this scientific, the word is quite intimidating to some, I think. Fermentation, it also immediately think, oh, there's so much science and danger and it's going to be hard. But in Ukraine, we don't use that word. Every time I'd go back to Ukraine and mention fermentatia, I'd translate it into Ukrainian, and I'd say, oh, auntie or my mom or whatever, can you tell me about fermentatia? And they would all laugh at me because it sounds so clinical. We don't use the word fermentatia. We use the word kwaszenia, which means just to make things sour. Because this is exactly what you do. You take a vegetable, you put it into a salt solution. So you just dissolve some salt, maybe a little bit of sugar or honey in some water. You put the vegetables in, you cover them for a bit, check up on them every other day. They fizz up and become sour, and then you bottle them up and you put them in the cellar somewhere cool. And then you've got, back in the day, you'd have these massive barrels, where you'd even find like massive watermelons ferment. It would ferment everything, of course, because there's a glut. So so my family would laugh at me because of this. But as you said, yeah, there's definitely a generational shift. A couple of summers ago now, I just overheard a conversation between my cousin Alyona and her daughter, her 15-year-old daughter, and she was telling Alyona, oh yes, and then granddad, my uncle, came over and he just dropped this massive sack of aubergines, that they've grown, that my auntie has grown, on the doorstep and left, unceremoniously, like that's it, just do. And my cousin went to her, and her mom was there as well, and she went to my auntie Luda, like, what am I supposed to do with 40 kilos of aubergines? They had this like little bickering kind of like funny argument situation, and my auntie said, well, you quass it, you're going to ferment them, aren't you? That's what we did. And she says, where am I going to find the time? Which brought me to think, how is there less time, or are there more distractions, or did the values kind of shift? What do people want to do with their free time? Or I don't know. It's an interesting kind of thing to think about, because of course here in the UK now we fermentation is a trend. People will spend their free time fermenting. Maybe they would be overwhelmed with 40 kilos of aubergines like that. But I think what my cousin ended up doing, she returned 20 kilos of aubergines, and then she did crack on with the other 20. They found some kind of a compromise. It's amazing, isn't it? In Ukraine, it's almost like 40 kilos of homegrown organic aubergines. I started kind of calculating it in my head how much that would cost, be ordered from Natura, and I was like, you're sitting on a on a treasure sack of treasure, like here, and I tried to also explain my point of view in that respect, and they would oh my god, the prices for organic fruit and vegetables in London, that's ridiculous. How it is ridiculous, and it isn't. Of course it takes people's energy and time to produce something organic, because it takes it's a lot harder to do as well, you know, not using pesticides, etc., etc. So of course it makes sense that it costs so much, but also I was trying to tell them, look, this is such a good thing that you've got this. Like, I just wanted to translate it to you and make you understand, like, that actually, you know, this is health and you know, so many positive things coming out of the food that you eat, you know, where here we can't really afford perhaps to all of us to eat like the way that they do in Ukraine still, especially in rural areas. Pluses and minuses.
Yeah, and you talked too about translating the cuisine, Ukrainian traditions to London flats in particular, kind of a small London flat or wherever people happen to be in the UK, translating it to a very alien food culture like the UK, and not just time, but the space that we have, like the 40 kilograms of aubergines, that would challenge me in my little flat. I'd be falling over them all the time.
No, absolutely. Space, but also another thing is, you know, for example, just to explain, of course, I have learned about the science of fermentation since I've been living here, even though before, no idea. You know, we just did it. My family just did it. And, you know, that's what it was. Sorry, baby's awake and making a little noise. But there's another thing to consider. For example, when I started, I used to live with my son in a tiny flat, and I decided to start doing fermentation in London. And I started doing it the way that my mom and my auntie would do it. So they'd just get some containers, they'd put the brine in, they put the vegetables in, and they kind of just like cover it with a muslin cloth and leave it there, and voila, you know, within 3-4 days, it's bubbling and it's amazing and it's working. And I started doing it, and it just wouldn't work in the way in this open container that I used to do. And, you know, of course, you know, there's so many things that you don't realize. For example, they already have, so how fermentation happens, just for those that don't know, you've got this brine solution, and the salt stops the bad bacteria to develop, some bad bacteria. And then all of the vegetables already have some yeasts on them, and you catch like all of these bacteria and yeasts that are kind of floating around your house. And this is how all of these processes start happening. And of course, my mom and my aunt and whoever lives in rural Ukraine, they've already got this kind of a microbiome almost, because they do so much of it. All of these positive, like good yeast and good bacteria are already present around. And that's why fermentation happens like this. It's already in the air. In my London flat, I didn't know any of this. And, you know, I'd use probably, at that point, I would be using, you know, chemical kind of like sprays around, cleaning everything, you know, whatever, because I don't know, I wasn't aware at that point. That was about like 6 years ago, something, when my son was little, or even longer than that. And, you know, that method didn't work for me. And also I didn't have all of these yeasts present already in my kitchen because I was a beginner. So my advice, and this is what I started kind of advising in my books, do it in a jar and start with small batches, but do it in a jar and cover the jar with a lid. So whatever good yeast and whatever was present in the fruit and vegetables, it's kind of like encapsulated in the jar, and it's doing that, instead of like opening it up and doing it in a massive barrel like I tried to do. You know, that might not immediately work.
Top advice. And it's reminding us that we quite often think of soil, and you have talked quite a lot about the richness of Ukrainian soil, but we often think of land as what kind of defines regional cooking. But actually, there you're cluing us into the fact that the air around us is defined by the kind of cooking we've been doing or not doing. And
exactly,
that's fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about your writing, and kind of interested to ask you where it sits in terms of, like, it feels like it sits amongst lots of different kinds of genres. Like there's a kind of sense of like almost like a memoir in the micro histories of family that you sometimes give us. One of my favorite ones. And your writing is full of love for the food and the culture you write about. And sometimes love itself becomes a kind of topic in the little stories. And I think I'm right in saying that your parents nearly fell out over how to cook crayfish. Have I got that right? Like, I love that. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, I think my dad and my mom, they're still a little bit traumatized over the whole story. So my mom is an incredible cook. Like, she's amazing, you know, taught by her grandmother, and, you know, she can spin dough around, whatever. But when they got married, there's one thing that she didn't know how to cook, and that was crayfish. And just to give you kind of like a little sub story, in Ukraine, crayfish, you know, it's a huge thing. In the summer, would literally, and I'm not exaggerating, would eat buckets of it. You drive, on the roads, whatever, and there'd be young men, boys, selling crayfish that they would have caught. And you'd get the crayfish and you make like a bucket of crayfish with dill and all of these aromatics. It's just really delicious. And then you just eat it with, my parents would have a beer and we'd just go like run around and just eat this crayfish. And my mom and dad just got married. So my dad brought this big bucket of crayfish to be cooked. And my mom put them, so I'm really sorry if this is going to upset some people, but she put it into a big pot of cold water and she basically boiled them very slowly. So my dad was just so shocked and so upset. Like he was like, "What did you do?" So yeah, that was a big kind of like drama with the crayfish. People put them straight into boiling water. Okay, you do not do that. You don't cook them from cold, or even better, put them in the freezer like you do with lobsters as well, to also kind of just like put them to sleep. So that's the most humane way, I think. But yeah, there have been some stories, mostly positive, but some are really disturbing like this that they haven't even gotten over yet.
We quite often put on our website with each film, we put any kind of trigger warnings or content warnings for anyone, just to give them a heads up about what they're going to encounter. So I'm now trying to imagine what we're going to write for that. But yeah, be careful with your crayfish.
Well, anyway, it's a good cautionary tale. If you are a beginner and you don't know how to cook crustaceans, this is the way to go.
That's good. Thank you for that. That's really helpful. And then I started asking you one question and then asked you a different question, which is terrible interview style. But that's a really good example of how your writing kind of works as a kind of memoir, almost like a diary, but at the same time, it also feels full of much wider research into the culture more generally. And as we've already touched on, you've got that really interesting challenge of opening up knowledge about this culture to new audiences, which you're doing. It feels like you're like a one-woman band doing that. You're doing that so brilliantly. And you've acknowledged predecessors, people are already doing that. But certainly, in the last 10, 15 years, you've done so much to educate us about this delicious food. So yeah, do you mind telling us a bit? Have I got that right? Are there these different genres of kind of memoir and then more kind of less personal and more research-based kind of work?
Absolutely. So especially with something like Mamushka, my first cookbook, it's my family's recipes. That's what that's why you would get, not just Ukrainian stuff. There's a couple of Azerbaijani recipes because my dad, his family married into an Armenian Azerbaijani family. So we've got connection to that. My grandmother, originally from Siberia, lived in Central Asia for 10 years in Uzbekistan. So there's Uzbeki recipes there as well. But yeah, all of the kind of little bits, little vignettes of my family history, which was great. And but at some point I realized that actually, hold on, I haven't traveled enough around Ukraine. I felt, it's such a huge country and it's so diverse. And I felt that my family history did communicate a little bit of the glimpses of Ukraine, but not fully, because every family is different. And I wanted to research and write more about Ukraine's history, about its culinary history, etc. So then this idea came to write an article about Ukrainian summer kitchens. In Ukraine, as I mentioned, we have these huge allotments / small holdings in small towns and rural kind of areas. And then in the 1950s, I think that's how they kind of started. They had a different form before that as well, but in the 1950s is how they came to be the way that they are now. So a young couple would get married, and before they built their main house, they would kind of build this structure, which is just a one-room house, basically. It looks like a normal Ukrainian house, but it's just one room inside. Maybe like a little corridor before it or something. And then they would put a makeshift bed there. They'd make a stove or like build a masonry oven if there was a specialist in the village. And then they'd live there for the warm 6 months of, spring, summer, kind of a little bit of autumn. And they'd live there and cook there while they built their bigger house. And, if it was in the past, maybe your community in the village would come and give you a hand, you know, in return for a meal, and then obviously a promise to help them out if they ever need it. You know, it was a really lovely thing. And then once the big house was built, this little house that they would have built would become a summer kitchen. So almost like a workshop, a little space, a studio in a way, a kitchen where women would cook, mostly women, but men also had their own jobs to do there too. But they would cook their daily meals there in the summer. And it was cooler, of course. You know, the houses would be, you know, the kitchen in the house would be kind of left alone. So there wouldn't be all this mess as well. You know, so many women that I interviewed all over Ukraine would say, oh, and of course, you know, it takes all the mess out of the house. The house is pristine. You don't have to worry about that. The kids don't hang around there that much. They just come into the kitchen, in the summer kitchen, and eat. And you could also open the windows and it would get really hot in Ukraine. I know a lot of people associate Ukraine with Russia, but especially in the south, it's Mediterranean heat. You know, it's really hot. And so you'd be cooking in cooler conditions as well, you know, especially pre-aircon kind of times. And also you do all of your preservation, you know, as I mentioned before, you're fermenting, jam making, etc. So come September, and that's why I called the first chapter of Summer Kitchens the September sessions. This is where all of the pickling would happen. So, you know, these big jars would be brought out from the cellars, cleaned, and, you know, you'd even find these spikes. I have a picture of that. These spikes outside the kitchen where you would put the jars to kind of drain, and then buckets and buckets of all of the produce, you know, all of the glut of your berries, your vegetables, etc., would be brought in. Children maybe would be given little jobs, like with a hairpin, taking stones out of the cherries or something, you know. And women would do this, you know, grafting. I mean, I know that I make Summer Kitchen sound super romantic, and of course they are in a way, but there was also like quite a lot of hard work that went into all of this preservation operation. And yeah, so and everybody in Ukraine would have the Summer Kitchen. So I thought, well, I'll write an article about that and go and research. And of course, during my initial research, I realized that pretty much every corner of Ukraine, every region, however different they are, and they are extremely different. You know, it's not just Italy and France that have regional cuisine. Ukraine, Poland, Russia, etc. Every country has their own, especially if it's a big kind of country. Everyone would have their own regional dishes, but everybody in Ukraine would have the Summer Kitchen, which again, from region to region would have a different name as well, which is really interesting. So I thought, oh, I'll write this article, but then I pitched the article probably really badly. I'm not very good at selling myself, so nobody wanted to publish it. So I thought, okay, I've already done this trip, and you know, I just kept on researching anyway, just out of interest. And then eventually, after I published Mamushka, after I published Caucasus, my second cookbook about the food of Azerbaijan and Georgia, eventually a publisher, Bloomsbury, you know, I pitched the book to them. I just thought, well, actually, Summer Kitchens would be a fantastic book. You know, I can use the Summer Kitchen as a prism through which we can look at different Ukrainian regions and families and kitchens and different culinary cultures, show the diversity and also the unity. So we're united by this tradition, but there are all of these different little bits coming through, especially by the borders. You know, Ukraine has 7 borders. So you've got a village, one of the villages that I went to, you know, from one vantage point that we were standing in, you could, in an equidistant, you could see Romania, Slovakia, and Hungary, you know, and in this village, a woman would say, oh, you know, my grandma was born in Czechoslovakia, she got married in the Soviet Union, she died in Ukraine, and she'd never left the village. You know what I mean? Like, it would just be, the borders of Ukraine changed so much, the cultures shifted, but, you know, now still there are these little summer kitchens that everybody has, and I thought it was a really lovely way to talk about unity and diversity and all of these topics, and ended up with the cookbook Summer Kitchen.
Absolutely, and that's sort of, you've put much better what I was trying to get at in terms of how you use the architecture of the home and the architecture of the summer kitchen as a prism, thinking about that diversity and unity. That's a really lovely way of putting it. And you write brilliantly too about Ukraine. You know, despite being so massive, as you point out, its name sort of means a borderland, and it has these really porous borders, and all kinds of different histories of colonizations, and of kind of culture swapping, and its food records those various histories. Olia, I'm wondering, we've touched a little bit, or you have touched a little bit, on the really fascinating issue of women's work in the history of Ukrainian food, and I'm really interested in gender, histories of gender, both within the cultures that you study, but also kind of in the book trade and in the cookery trade more generally. That I could be wrong about this, but my sense is that it's often the men who write these kind of global cookbooks traveling around the world. And it's, I think of women, for example, like Future Dunlop on Szechuan cuisine, who write these much more kind of culturally specific and targeted and brilliantly researched books. So I'm gonna lob the question of gender at you, and you can do whatever you want with it. But both in terms of women's work, your first book is called Mamushka, but also in terms of gender at the level of the cookbook trade that you work in. Do you mind telling us a bit about any of that?
Ooh. Where do I start? Thank you for hurling that one at me.
It is an absolutely massive question. I suppose from the Ukrainian point of view and from your work's point of view, it feels like there's a rich heritage of women's work around food in particularly from a 20th century context. We were talking earlier about Ukraine's own history. You know, that kind of the Soviet collectivization was a very kind of male-led enterprise, and a lot of your books are about women thriving and surviving through that period. So there's something there, I think, about women's work in the wider patriarchal world.
Yeah, they thriving despite everything, kind of, in a way, definitely. I mean, for example, my maternal grandmother, Lucia, who's been through her own kind of hell, like from her childhood. I mean, in the 30s, because she was a daughter of a farmer, the Bolsheviks kind of like, took everything, basically took the house, kicked them out, took all of their land, their animals, etc., and have sent her, the other 3 siblings, and my grandmother on a cattle train to Siberia, and like threw them out in the wintry forest, see you later. They survived. One son vanished, but they survived and eventually came back. And of course, my grandma's dad remained in Ukraine. So, they really were good at separating families. That's how they kind of tried to, that was a way to control people. But they returned from Siberia to Ukraine, then survived the war, etc. And so she had a super hard life. Then her husband, my granddad Vita, was in the war, escaped to camp, was a prisoner of war, etc. His own story, of course. So when he came back from the war, I remember him, and he was very gentle and extremely kind of subdued, very funny, and but liked his having his wine, glass of wine on the quiet. And of course, oh my God, the trauma that they would have come back with, the PTSD, etc., that it wasn't really addressed in any, in this kind of therapy way or whatever. It was immense. And it turned out that it was my grandma that assumed this almost role of a matriarch in a way. She was the one who we saw as, really kind of powerful is the wrong word for it, but she was kind of definitely the more authoritative one in the family in a way. Very gentle and kind woman, but also kind of I feel like she just had to do it, and she had 6 children, a small holding, and she did. She really kicked ass, and also nourish them with this amazing cooking. So as you say, despite all of these collectivization and standardization, there was nothing in the shops. The shop shelves would be completely bare, and of course she grew her own vegetables and cooked her own wonderful food. And sometimes I feel like another thing that they did was to get together and have food together over a table. And I have very vivid memories of that as a child, where they would eat, they would drink. Us kids would be like eating and, you know, running around a little bit, but they'd be like all together at the table, and, you know, all of these stories would be exchanged. Sometimes they'd sing, especially after a couple of you know, shots of homemade, you know, what my auntie used to call micronutrients. So, you know, they made like berry wine, which was really delicious from the homegrown berries. And then, you know, they would laugh a lot and retell all of these stories from back in the day, and then they would cry as well. And that was actually a really, you know, us as kids would be like, oh, boja, you know, they're crying again. You know, we wouldn't really understand what was happening at that point. We did and we didn't, you know, because we would overhear these stories. And as a kid, I'd be quite shocked, actually. And even now, sometimes when I think about these stories, I can picture them so vividly. It's as if I was there, you know, because there were these fantastic storytellers. So anyway, I just feel like another role that my grandma assumed with all of this cooking and having this massive family together, because, you know, 6 children of, you know, quite a big generation gap between them as well, and their children, and then us. And it would be wonderful. She would assume also this role of a therapist in a way, you know, because that's, I realize now that's what it was. You know, they didn't have to go and talk to someone they didn't know. They could just sit together and do the laughing and crying together and process all of these things and all of these stories from the past. And everybody would be really interested, you know. And I eventually, when I grew up a little bit, you know, when I was from the age of 8 or 10, I'd be there, you know, I wouldn't be running around anymore, I'd just be there kind of like listening, because they were just incredible stories, something that you'd probably just see in the movie or something, you know. And yeah, so she was definitely that kind of formidable figure. As I say, extremely kind, but also quite like, you know, straight back. Until the day that she died, she was just had this presence, you know. And my granddad would be more of the take the back seat and just kind of sit there and listen and sometimes say something. So, you know, so from my perspective, even though, don't get me wrong, there was, you know, all over Ukraine or Soviet Union or whatever, like the gender equality thing wasn't really, not in the modern terms, it wasn't. But within my family personally, I always felt that the women in my family were kind of definitely on the same level, if not, you know, even more kind of authoritative is such a horrible word. I don't know. I can't find a word for it. But yeah. And I guess that definitely kind of like that whole vibe in a way passed on to my mom. And in a way, and yeah, it's an interesting, the gender thing is an interesting way to explore, and I kind of try to explore that a little bit in my second book, Caucasus, as well, because they had a very similar thing in Georgia, to the point of a word entered the Georgian language, which the word is dedekatsi, which literally means mother man. And that's what these women were, you know. After the war, very similar situations, you know, men would come traumatized and women kind of like assumed these roles of mothers, but also men. So they would do everything, you know, around the house, you know. And it's still, yeah, I can still see that. So I did my research in Georgia, and we'd be, you know, we traveled all around the country and went into people's homes, and you would see that so much, you know, women just doing everything. And it's a really interesting topic to explore. But I think the war has done quite a lot for that kind of like what it did to gender. Sorry, my brain is melting a little bit now, but I hope you know what I mean.
Yeah. No, it's really helpful, and it's a really good pointer to what makes your work so special, and why we're lucky to have it is that, you know, there's that long history of women essentially defending a culture in the face of a Soviet authority, which is quite keen to break families up, and to presumably partly to do that in order to help impose their own forms of culture. And so, you know, there you have this family history of protecting the culture, which you are now passing on to thousands and thousands of people. So it's a really good clue as to what makes your work so special. I think it's continuing that, and it's bringing it to new audiences. So yeah, I'm sorry to lob in a curveball at you, but I really appreciate it.
That's all right. It's a really difficult, I mean, I will admit it's a difficult one to navigate because nothing is so black and white.
And I also think, I'll move to my final question now, but I also think coming out of a lot of what you said earlier, there's some really good lessons in Ukrainian cultural traditions for lockdown, I think, because so much of it is about communities rallying around each other and looking out for neighbours, looking out for family members in a way which many of us have now got to get used to in completely alien ways in the last year and within kind of very alien circumstances. So yeah, I think we all need to be a little bit more Ukrainian in our forms of family care. It's okay to move to my final question. So the project you're speaking to us for is called A Bit Lit, and we're really interested in where literature sits for people generally. And you are yourself the author of no less than 3 books. So be really interested to hear from you what literature means to you, either as a word or as a concept.
Yeah, actually for this one, I would quickly go back to my grandmother, Lucia, the one that I've just described a lot. So despite having this extremely busy and hard life with the 6 children, the farm, etc., my mom said that she would, do all of her stuff, put the children to bed. I don't know how she did it and how often she did it, but she did. She would read at night. So she'd put everyone to bed. And then, she was a massive fan of historical novels. So Walter Scott, all of the French, Dumas, I don't know, Proust, you name it. Yeah. So in this Ukrainian village, I can just picture her, like going into bed, and she would read until like 3 a.m. in the morning. And for 5, she would have to get up and, milk her cow or something. So, and I knew about this from the early start. And my mom also, there were always books around. We had this massive library. So from a very early age, I think my mom taught me how to read when I was 4 or 5. I was a massive bookworm. So I guess it all kind of like trickled down from my grandma into my mom and then to me. And, I clearly remember like all I wanted to do when I was little, I just wanted to either draw or read. And, the type of kid that would read under the with the torchlight under the covers kind of thing. And, really savor my books. So it's a massive part of my life and my upbringing. I guess it all, that's why, I don't know what came first, the love of literature or this whole fascination with storytelling, with the oral tradition of storytelling that we've had in my family, where, all of these family stories would be passed down and voiced, very often, whenever we'd get together and whenever would have a meal, that'd be stories exchanged or remembered. Sometimes the same story would come and some new elements of it would come out. But yeah, we've all been, massive kind of literature fans. And of course, I ended up studying it at university as well, quite a lot. And, had a big bit of a hiatus after I had my first son, Sasha, 9 years ago. I feel like for 2 years, I was such a tired kind of young parent. I kind of stopped reading. But recently, in the last 3 years, that's it. I'm just like, okay, phone stays downstairs from 7 p.m. I don't touch it. It just goes away. And since, this year only, I've already read 8 books. And it's just like, yes, yeah. All you need to do is just put it away, take a book with you, and you'll get a better sleep. And, you learn something and enrich your kind of soul. So yeah, it's extremely important.
That's really fascinating. And Olia, it's so interesting hearing what your grandmother was reading, because Walter Scott's books are a kind of repository of old Scottish food traditions. I think Dumas wrote a dictionary of food. I could be wrong about that. And of course, Proust is famous. Principally, the most famous moment in Proust is about eating the Madeleine and then having these incredible memories.
I'm ashamed to say I've never read Proust, so I don't know how she, she must have like read it in, in a couple of days or something, with all those hours of, nighttime by the candlelight or something crazy.
Olia, it's been a real joy to speak to you. Thank you again for your work, which I have learned much from and has enriched my diet in lots of ways. So thank you. And thank you for being so open and sharing so much about your career and about your work.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed myself immensely.
Take care.
Bye. Thank you, Andy. Bye.